All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the talk about everything as a cookbook, service-oriented thinking for your code. So who am I? My name is Tom Duffield. I'm a consulting engineer with Chef. If you are interested in contacting me or stalking me or something like that, you can check out my details on that. But what I'm here to talk about today is something that I get asked a lot in my role as a consulting engineer with Chef, and that is best practices about creating cookbooks. Well, I hate that term. Everyone wants best practices until they don't, because they disagree with them, and then they're like, no, those are bad practices. But I like to think of trying to find good practices. And these good practices that I'm going to tell you about today are based on the good development practices that I have based on my experience just in my own education, and I've been using Chef for about 3 or 4 years now, so just based on what I've learned over that period of time. So many of you are probably familiar with one or more of these terms: wrapper cookbook, LWRPs, environment cookbooks. These are all different patterns for creating cookbooks that have arisen over the past year or so. And the reason I'm talking about them today is that they are confusing for a lot of new users. And I say that because my job is working with newer users in the fundamentals training course. And they hear about these things, but they don't understand them. And especially for things like roll cookbooks, which are a replacement of chef rolls, they don't understand why both are there, because they just don't understand why you would want the benefits of rolls versus a roll cookbook, and vice versa. But even the more intermediate to advanced chef developers that I've worked with still have a lot of questions about these patterns. When should I use a wrapper cookbook? Should a cookbook use node attributes, LWRPs, or both to modify behavior? Should I write custom resources as lightweight resource providers or heavyweight resource providers? Am I a bad person if I don't use Ruby? And is a library cookbook still a library cookbook if there's more than just libraries in it? So there's a lot of confusion around those terms. And what we really need are clear guidelines on what patterns to use and when to use them. So I've been thinking about this for a while, and I came to the conclusion that I needed to go back to the core foundation of Chef, and that is talk about what you are trying to do and not how. So that's what I'm going to talk about, is creating patterns based on what we're trying to automate and not how we're trying to automate. And to do this, I'm going to start by referencing a well-established model, and that's the cloud computing model. You have software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. And if you're unfamiliar, I'm just going to quickly go over each one of these. So infrastructure as a service are your EC2, your Rackspace, DigitalOcean. They provide the very foundational bits and pieces that you would use to build up your infrastructure. Platform as a service are things like Heroku and Elastic Beanstalk, where a lot of the infrastructure has already kind of been decided for you, but it's giving you an option for something to deploy your application into. And then you have software as a service, which we all use every day. Many of you are probably even using one now in this very room. And those are things like Gmail, Google Apps Suite, Salesforce, those types of things. And those you don't have a lot of configuration control around the really deep lower layers. So what I did was basically Command-C, Command-V. Take these patterns and just kind of mold them slightly so that we can use them for our cookbook design. But before I talk about each one of these cookbooks, the application platform and infrastructure cookbooks, I want to talk about global patterns that should be prevalent across any cookbook that you write. The first pattern is that your recipes should be modular, so that the users who download them can be selective about the policies that they want to enforce. And here's an example from our Chef Client Cookbook. You have a different recipe for each of the different things that you're trying to do. So it's not one big recipe where you're doing everything. You have an option about which recipe you want to put into your run list. So you also don't want to be too prescriptive in these recipes, because even if you give your best intention to make it very, very reusable and customizable and global, inevitably you're going to leave somebody out and they're going to end up forking it. And that's what happened with a lot of the cookbooks, pre-summit. We talked about this at the Chef Summit last year, that the Apache cookbook just gotten out of control because there was just so many different bells and whistles and knobs inside of it. So you want to keep your recipes small. I mean, in the case of like the cron recipe here, downloading and starting just the basic package and service. And then what you can do is expose custom resources that allow you to that allow your users to facilitate their implementation-specific configuration for those things. So if you're unfamiliar with the Apache 2 cookbook, it has a custom resource called Web App, which will help set up an Apache website. And it has this really great feature where you can actually specify a vhost configuration file from the cookbook that you're calling this custom resource from. So you're not forced to follow the vhost configuration that the Apache 2 cookbook selects for you. You can specify your own. So these types of patterns of giving people the bare minimum that they would need to get the service running, and then giving them frameworks and interfaces to configure, is something that should be prevalent in any cookbook that you write, regardless if you subscribe to the pattern that I'm about to talk about. So these lights are hot. I'm going to take a drink of water. So infrastructure cookbooks. Infrastructure cookbooks manage the basic building blocks of your nodes. They manage the operating system layers like package repositories, very core services like NTP and cron, set up storage, the LVM cookbook. Maybe they manage some networking like DNS bind date or hosts files or your IP route tables. Maybe they install just very fundamental cookbooks. And you can kind of identify what makes an infrastructure cookbook by looking at its dependencies. Because it's at the lowest layer, it's the base, they typically have no or very few dependencies on other cookbooks. So that's an indicator that you can use to determine whether something might be an infrastructure cookbook or not. And then you can figure out where it fits in your application stack based on that. Now, platform cookbooks. Platform cookbooks are probably more popular and you use them more frequently because they're the ones that sit right below your application. And these are cookbooks like Tomcat, Node.js, Rails, Apache 2, Nginx, MySQL, like all of the things that you set up to make your application your application. And they can include things like Sensu and Zabbix, and they're that middle layer, that they're not the lowest, but they're the middle layer. And once again, you can kind of determine that by looking at their dependencies. Because they're that middle tier, that platform tier, they'll depend on a lot of infrastructure cookbooks. They'll depend on things like apt and build essential and run it. Because they're that middle layer, they're providing you a framework or a runtime execution layer for you to deploy your application into. And the reason you use platform cookbooks directly more often than you use infrastructure cookbooks is because you're more commonly using the custom resources that they expose. Things like apt repository to set up an apt repository, or that Apache web app resource that I was talking about in the global patterns section, that they allow you to set up that execution layer consisting of these custom resources and maybe core chef resources and maybe infrastructure cookbook custom resources as well. But the cookbook pattern that I think most everyone deals with on a day-to-day basis are what we're going to call application cookbooks. Now, unfortunately, this is difficult because there's not a lot of great examples of application cookbooks out there because they're not shareable. They're for your specific use case, so it doesn't do you very much good to share them. So I have an example cookbook that kind of makes its way around the community called MyFace up on my GitHub, and you can kind of see an example of that. But application cookbooks are something that was mentioned last year in the Berkshelf keynote that Riot Games uses for all of their stuff that they have, the application, and then they have the cookbook that they use to deploy that application kind of kept together and in the same development workflow. It's tied very heavily with the application that it's managing. And so it itself continues to subscribe to some of those base policies where you have a recipe for each module or each functional tier, that you have a database recipe that is responsible for creating your database, that has everything that it needs to create a database, or a web server recipe that has everything that it needs to create a web server. And the nice thing about this is that you can use it with this model. You can give this cookbook to your application developers, your actual app developers, and they can use this to launch up a VM on their local machine and deploy their code directly into that. They don't need a live environment. They don't need to configure their own workstation to the best of their ability to match the production environment. They can use the exact same recipe code that they could use, that will be used to spin up their production environment. So a common pattern you'll see is that the default the default recipe in an application cookbook will be something to spin up a full dev stack. Application cookbooks will then kind of leverage both custom resources exposed by the infrastructure and platform cookbooks in addition to the core chef resources. So here's an excerpt from that database recipe from that MyFace application. You can see that that first resource is a MySQL database resource. It's going to set up that MySQL database. Then the next one is you have a cookbook file that's going to put that MySQL and a init SQL file onto your server. And then you have an execute resource that's going to take that file and then seed your database. So everything that you would need to spin up a MySQL database for your application is in one recipe. And it's great because when looking at this, you don't necessarily need to care about how that MySQL database is created. It shortens up and abstracts away complexity that maybe people who are managing the cookbook at this level don't need to know about. Something else that you can do with this type of pattern is instead of defining a run list in a role, you essentially define your run list now using a series of include recipe statements and chef resources in a recipe. So if we had a theoretical CI server recipe in our MyFace cookbook, we would set up our Jenkins server and then install a bunch of plugins that were necessary for our CI pipeline, which means that instead of having role MyFace CI server, you could technically have recipe MyFace CI server in your run list. They would do theoretically the same thing if the recipe contained all of the bits and pieces that the role had originally. Other times, people still like to keep the roles around for nostalgic purposes, I guess. And they'll actually just map the application cookbook recipe one-to-one with a role. And sometimes this is helpful because maybe you don't maybe there are bits and pieces that you want to put onto the node but aren't technically part of the application. Maybe you don't control the full stack. Maybe you give your cookbook to another operations team and then they deploy it, but they have other things that they want to put on the node as well. So which one of these two methods should you choose? Well, whichever one you are more comfortable with. And I can say I've used both in production. They're interchangeable. There's really no right way. It's just the way that you think is going to work best for your organization. Another great thing about application cookbooks is that you can control the cookbook version constraints of your application from within your metadata.rb. And this allows you to treat your entire application stack as a kind of a bundle that you can take all of it and move the entire thing through QA. So you know that when you take application, MyFace version 2.0.0, it's going to be hard-coded with those cookbook dependencies. So if someone comes along and uploads Apache 2.0 to the Chef server, your application is not going to use it because you've set the cookbook constraint. Now, sometimes you can do more flexible constraints like the ones we have on the screen, or you can do more restrictive constraints like equals. But it allows you to treat your entire application as an artifact. So you can promote it through environments with all of its dependencies bundled together. And this is really cool because then it allows you to do things like this. If you have an environment where you have two applications that are being installed, the two applications have different development streams, and maybe they have different dependencies. Maybe MyFace depends on Apache 1.8, and their face depends on Apache 2.0. You have different versions of Apache that you want to lock down, but in an environment file, when you call just the cookbook, you're restricting yourself to everyone's going to use Apache 2.0, regardless. But now, each of your applications that are in your Chef environment can continue to remain locked down to the cookbook version that they have been tested against. And you can see this here. So if we had Apache 4.0 and MySQL 5.0, everyone in production is going to have to use that cookbook because that's what's been locked down. But here, if you use this method, obviously I changed my slides here. MyFace can use Apache 4.0 and their face could do 3.8. So that was a very quick explanation of the pattern. So in summary, what we have are recipes should be modular to allow users to be selective about the policies that they enforce. Recipes should be minimally prescriptive. Don't force people to subscribe to unnecessary patterns. Allow them to substitute their own if they need to. You also want to make sure that you have repeatable patterns for implementation-specific configurations, and you use those maybe instead of having recipes. So instead of having a IP hosts recipe, you have an IP host custom resource. And then you can classify your cookbooks as infrastructure, platform, and application, and this helps you visualize the interactions between the different cookbooks. It'll also help you keep your cookbooks modular and reusable, because if you don't put your implementation-specific configuration in your infrastructure and your platform cookbooks, then they can be more easily shared across a larger population of people. So that's all I have today. I was given very short notice on this talk, so I'm sorry it's a little short. If you have any more questions, but we're going to have plenty of time to answer questions here, I'm going to be holding office hours right after this in Marina. Otherwise, if you want to see if you can run and catch the end of another talk, you can reach out to me online. But at this point, I am happy to answer any questions that anyone has, and thank you for coming.
Hi. So if you're switching to everything as a cookbook, let's say, and ditching roles or locking the environment for the top-level application cookbook, would you then just manage attributes in the top-level cookbook? Would you, I mean, you didn't have a lot of examples of attributes in there, I saw.
Yeah, well, technically, yes. You would have all of your attributes. They could be managed in that top-level cookbook for all of the attributes of all of the dependent cookbooks in the stream. I see that pattern a lot, but there's no reason you couldn't also put those attributes in your roles or your environments if you're still using those. It's a flexible pattern, but yes, I have seen, like if you want MySQL to be listening on a certain port, you would set that attribute in your database recipe.
Suppose you have multiple containers or VMs that need to be configured in harmony, so they need to be aware of each other's services. Do you suggest maintaining the parameters at the application layer, the application cookbook layer, or would that be more of the platform layer in order to maintain that congruence?
You could probably do either. The pattern suggests right now that you would put them in the application layer because, well, it depends on what is actually controlling the containers themselves. Like if you wanted to manage, like for example, if you wanted to manage what port Docker exposes, you could put that in the Docker cookbook and allow people to overwrite it wherever they want. That would probably be a good solution. Or in a situation maybe where you want to manage something that's inside of Docker and it's going to be a little bit different for each implementation, then that might be something you maybe want to make as an option in your platform cookbook, but then set in your application cookbook. Like it's the goal is to make it as flexible as possible, but without getting too prescriptive. Did that answer your question? Okay, good.
Do you have any comments on the use of Bookshelf as opposed to the cookbooks maintained?
Well, I think that the Bookshelf pattern fits very nicely with this because in your application cookbook, you just have a Burks file that will reference your metadata and download all of the cookbooks that you need. But that's not a necessity for it. You could have everything in one big cookbooks directory. This pattern, I think, exists outside of that. It can be either. I personally have seen more people go with, when using this pattern, use Bookshelf or Librarian or some type of dependency resolver, because then what they can do is when someone new comes on, they basically just give them this repository, tell them to run Burks install, and then they're good to go.
Hi. We have actually a typical deployment of Git, Gerrit on top of it, and then Chef Server. And through Chef Server, we are managing different type of environments. So just wanted to get a solution on how to manage different versions. Say, I want to keep N+1 version of application in non-prod, while N in production. With this configuration, say there is a version repository, there is a review system, and then there is Chef Server. Is there a better way to manage versioning?
Well, so are you talking about versioning of the dependent cookbooks or the versioning of the application cookbooks?
Cookbooks.
Well, for cookbooks that you don't control, that's kind of hard. What I've seen in the past is odd number patches are development and even numbered patches are releases. So when you release a cookbook, you release it with a version number that has an even numbered patch number, and then immediately you bump it up to an odd numbered patch for your development purposes, and then you just keep that pattern going. So you can have like a development cookbook version in your chef server without having to deal with a whole bunch of conflict. Does that answer your question? Yep. Okay.
Sorry, hopefully this isn't a silly question, but you said, I think earlier you referenced like you should use custom resources as opposed to using like a cookbook recipe. Does like your example, the My Face one, have like an example of that by chance or anything like that, or like kind of like a best practice? Or
well, the My Face is the application cookbook, so it wouldn't necessarily expose any custom resources. One, I think a good example would be what Sean O'Mara has done with the MySQL cookbook. That it used to be you'd have a recipe to install a server, and then if you wanted like multiple servers installed on the same, multiple MySQL servers installed on the same server, it was really hard to actually end up doing that. And he worked it in such a way that now setting up a MySQL server is just a custom resource. So if you can set up like n number of MySQL service resources in a recipe, and you'll get that number of actual MySQL servers running on your node.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Okay, who's next? Right on. Well, if we don't have any more, we can wrap up. I believe we have 20 minutes until the next session. If you want to come hang out with Tom, if you didn't want to broadcast your question to all of us, you're more than welcome to come up and ask him personally. Otherwise, please join me in thanking Tom.
Thank you.